Our next speaker is Dr. Marlene Haffner, and like Rod and Bob, she's a distinguished member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the IGNITE project. And as others have said, what a powerful SAB it is. No doubt the most powerful that I've seen in my 11 years with Genome Atlantic. Prior to establishing her own consulting company called Haffner Associates, Marlene served as the Executive Director, Global Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at Amgen, and prior to that, amongst other things, she served as the Director of the Office of Orphan Products Development of the FDA for 20 years. Given her wealth of knowledge and extensive first-hand experience in the orphan disease area, Marlene's presentation will focus on what's happening internationally and particularly in the US in the context of drugs for rare diseases. So, Marlene, welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me add my thanks to Dalhousie and to the group at IGNITE for the work that they are doing, which I really think is phenomenal. And I'm just honored to be a part of this. I find it very, very exciting. So I did spend 20 years at the FDA's Office of Orphan Products Development. I got there because I was working at FDA in medical devices, and what I was doing did not give me any intellectual challenge, and I went to the FDA commissioner and I said, Dr. Young, I'm bored to tears. I'm afraid I'm going to self-destruct, and I either need to find a new job in FDA or I need to go out in private industry. And Frank said, well, you give me 6 weeks. I said, I'll give you 6 weeks, but that's it. 6 weeks to the day, he called and said, how would you like to run orphan drugs? And I said, what in God's name are they? And so the rest is history. Whoops. And I came to the Office of Orphan Products Development in 1986. The law itself was passed in 1982, just about 30 years ago. It was signed in 1983 by President Reagan. There's going to be a great big 30th anniversary celebration in Washington sometime in 2013. But at the time that the Orphan Drug Act was passed, there was virtually no enthusiasm for it, either in FDA or in pharma. I don't know whether bio existed at that time. The enthusiasm came from patients and from a small group that had headed up a committee which issued a report which was called Little Known Drugs of Significant Value. And that was the basis for it. FDA, because of pressure, established the office in 1982. And following that, orphan drug programs did occur throughout the world, but it took a while. Singapore was the first, and what they basically said was, if it's an orphan and it's good enough for the United States, it's good enough for us, and you can import it. Japan came about in 1993. There was a private physician, Dr. Minamoto, who got it in his head, and I don't remember why, that Japan needed an Orphan Drug Act. And he put together a consortium, and lo and behold, the next thing I knew was that I was going over to the Japanese Congress, their diet, and talking with them about what had worked in the US Orphan Drug Act. And they passed an Orphan Drug Act, which is somewhat different than what the US has. Then Australia in 1998, The EU finally came online in 1999. Taiwan has an Orphan Drug Act. Turkey has an Orphan Drug Act. Canada has had a lot of discussion about Orphan Drug Acts for a long time. And that's another reason why I congratulate Ignite for their efforts. Because you're interested in it for the science and for the patients, and not necessarily for any commercial incentives that can be garnered. And there are incentives in the US Orphan Drug Act, and quite frankly, that's what makes it work. There's lots of other interest today in orphan drug development and orphan drug regulation and legislation literally around the world. So what are the incentives of the US Orphan Drug Act? And each jurisdiction, government jurisdiction that has an act has a different paradigm. And they have a different paradigm because there are different cultures and different ways that things work. So what works for the US doesn't necessarily work in Australia or Japan or Taiwan. So each country has developed their own way of doing things. But in the US, the law says that there is protocol assistance. That seemed very important in 1982. It hasn't been used in possibly 20 years, although the Europeans use it extensively. We have better ways, the US has better ways of meeting with companies than protocol assistance originally was. Grant support to academia, to small companies, to cross what is frequently called the valley of death, that huge step from bench to bedside. Companies may not be interested until there's something that's been used for patients, and just to get funding for that is extraordinarily difficult. So the US Orphan Drug Act does have a grant mechanism. It's a small one. It hasn't grown much over the years, but it's an important one. In the US, one pays to have your product reviewed, whether it's an orphan product or a non-orphan product. But orphans are waived from that review fee, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act fee called PDUFA. And in fiscal 2012, where we are now, that's 1.8 million. Then there's tax credits for clinical development, which has a 20-year carry forward and a 1-year fallback period, and assistance provided by the Office of Orphan Products Development, which is the OOPD. That assistance is a lot of FDA translation. What did they really mean when they said? And the office spends a lot of time doing just that. In the US, the prevalence of an orphan disease is 200,000 in the US. US being the first country to have an Orphan Drug Act, pulled a number out of consideration that was a surrogate for profitability. Japan also has a number. Other jurisdictions have done ratios because populations change. And I think, China is looking at a ratio that I think is 1 in 500,000 in the population, because their population is so large. EU has 5 in 10,000. So that's the differences that you see. As I said, the office was established in 1982. There are 2 individuals that were the movers and shakers that I think got the project going, helped get the law passed, and stayed involved with it for quite some time. They are Marion Finkel and Abby Myers. Marion was in the office as the original founder left in about 1985. And Abby retired only in 2008. Abby, for me, is the prototype of the saying, "Hell hath no fury as woman scorned." Abby has 3 children with Tourette syndrome, and her children did not have approved drugs. And that made her more than a little bit angry. And there's a whole long story associated, but basically, Abby decided that there was going to be an Orphan Drug Act. And she still stays very much involved. I guess I am running out of power. The Office of Orphan Products Development is an unusual office in FDA. It is what I would call a white hat regulatory office. It designates a drug as an orphan drug. It says, yes, the population is correct, and yes, this drug has some reasonable assuredness that it will work in this disease. That's their main reason for existence. They don't have any authority for the drug development, although they do meet extensively with the review divisions that ultimately determine whether that drug will or will not be approved. And they have a lot to say, and it's always said behind closed doors in the pre-meetings as to, hey guys, look, this is a disease that we've been looking for therapy for a long time. Talk to the patients. Talk to people that have the disease that are taking the drug. Find out if they're willing to put up with some of these side effects. Find out if they're willing to take this risk. No, you can't do 2 well-controlled double-blind clinical trials. The population is 500 in the US. You aren't going to find them. All this goes on before the company comes in the room. So frequently I heard from companies that, you know, that office is just quiet as a church mouse. They might as well be a stone. Well, they've done a lot of work beforehand. They may or may not have won, but they've done a lot of work beforehand. And quite frankly, sometimes they go back and say to the sponsor, look, I know you only want to do 1 pivotal trial, but the fact of the matter is, with 95,000 patients in the US and centers worldwide that study this disease, you can find enough patients for 2 well-controlled clinical trials. So the office is a spokesperson or an ombudsperson back and forth. There have been over 3,000 products that have been designated since 1983. And I say here 300 approvals. It's actually closer to 400 approvals that have been given. And of those 400 approvals, the smallest patient population for which a drug was approved is 0. Those are drugs to treat radiation sickness or other issues that might come up from acts of bioterrorism. The smallest population for a disease that we know that really affects people today was 10, and that was for one of the kinds of severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome. Those kids who used to be dead by the age of 6 are now alive and well and going to college. The largest population of which I'm aware was 192,000, and that was at that time for patients that needed erythropoietin for end-stage renal disease. So the spectrum of the size of the populations has varied. By far and away, most of them are for diseases affecting fewer than 10,000 people in the US. It was mentioned earlier, Bob mentioned it, that orphan drugs are hot. And you can't pick up any pharmaceutical journal of any kind without reading something about orphan drugs, be it from an economic basis that I saw one headline, orphan drug sales to hit $6 billion this year. That always makes me cringe because I feel that there will be concern that they're not needed if they are that financially useful. But what's also true is that about 1/3 of all new molecular entities that are approved today by the FDA are orphan drugs. Just an impressive number. And I think something that was not at all considered at the time that the Orphan Drug Act was passed. FDA has become, on their own, more and more interested in orphan drugs. They're seeing small clinical trials being presented to them. So there have been courses actually implemented for the review staff so that they know best how to assist in the design and conduct of these very small clinical trials. In addition to the Office of Orphan Products Development, FDA established a new office it's almost 2 years old now, which is the Associate Director for Orphan Drugs in the Office of New Drugs in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in Cedar. And her responsibility is to look policy-wise at consistency across the review divisions. Because, one review division would say, oh no, not over my dead body are you going to get away with one clinical trial. And another review division would say, oh, that looks good. Sure, we can do it on one trial. And realizing that all diseases and all drugs are different, you have to have some common definition as to how decisions are indeed made among and between the divisions. There's excellent communication between the Office of Orphan Products and the Center for Drugs Orphan Office. And I think that's come a long way. Bob Bell mentioned safety was paramount in FDA's thought processes right now. It is. FDA walks an interesting tightrope. On the one hand, they are continually fussed at that they don't approve drugs as quickly as they should. And on the other hand, Congress beats them about the head and shoulders if there is a death from any drug. So you're never right. It's the nature of the beast, but one does have to try to balance as best one can. And then in addition to FDA's efforts, of course, NIH has an Office of Orphan Products, Office of Rare Disease Research, and that is headed by Steve Groff. Steve is the founder and has been there since then, and they have big-time money, which they award to consortia to look at certain elements of rare diseases. And then recently, there's been the foundation of and NIH founded TREND, Translational Research in Something Diseases, but in rare diseases. And that office, too, is looking at, they have a huge library of drugs available to them, and they are scanning drugs for their potential in rare diseases. So rare diseases are hot. It's kind of nice. The Institute of Medicine had a committee on rare disease research. They pointed out the lack of consistency in FDA, and that's exactly when that new office was founded. They asked for a national plan for orphan products, and I don't think that that's going to happen in my lifetime. But other countries do have national plans for orphan products and for more for orphan diseases and how they are handled and policies for treating them. The human genome description made a major impact onto the discovery and treatment of products to treat rare diseases. Not that we know everything. God knows. I said earlier as I was listening to Rod, the more we know, the less we know. And it's going to continue that way for a while, if not forever, and that's good. But the human genome description has been a major help, and maybe also have an impact on whether we have blockbuster drugs or not, because as we target drugs more specifically to diseases and not to bits and pieces of symptoms, we may have fewer blockbuster drugs. Big companies are becoming involved and excited. GSK has a unit, Pfizer has a unit, Novartis has a unit. There's a bunch of units around in big pharma companies. And I was at a bio meeting some years ago when someone from Sirona got up and said, had it not been for the U.S. Orphan Drug Act, we wouldn't have a bio industry, because we offered the only intellectual property protection that existed for drugs that are mainly that for biotech drugs that are very hard to patent. If one looks quickly, and I know this is a busy slide, but if you have the Office of the Commissioner at the very top, and then Office of Medical Products and Tobacco, and into that office sits each of the centers, Center for Drugs, Center for Biologics, et cetera. And also in that office is the Office of Special Medical Programs, where the Office of Orphan Products sits. So both the Center for Drugs and the Office of Orphan Products have the same boss. And that's helpful in the long run. FDA reviews orphan products exactly the same as every other product. They have to be safe and effective for their intended use, but there also has to be flexibility. Use of biomarkers is increasing with lots of post-marketing commitments, and I think that if you get an orphan product approved in the United States, you can be assured that you will have a post-marketing commitment to keep track of that drug and patients together to see what the long-term consequences are. I mentioned already that orphan products may be more effective than run-of-the-mill products, but we also don't know the safety parameters as well. Most approvals come from 2 well-controlled, double-blinded clinical trials. Occasionally, there's one pivotal trial. There's also an increasing push to learn more about natural history of these drugs. Orphan drugs orphan diseases are not well studied for the most part, and we just don't know the full spectrum of the disease. And that's very, very important when you're looking at a drug to treat that disease. Some of the issues that exist. There's been a lot of play about the cost of orphan drugs. I want someone to fund a study looking at that, because I'm not sure that rumor or that statement is true. If you took biotech drugs for oncology, some of those are pretty expensive. Do you give them for a lifetime? Usually not. But it would be an interesting study to look at cost per month, cost per year, and cost per life. Because I'd like to know the answer to it. I'd like to know whether that's a true statement, and then, how we explain it from a policy basis. Patients don't understand the the FDA drug process. I don't think many practicing physicians that are not in academia truly understand how drugs are discovered and reviewed and developed and approved. Most of the orphan diseases are life-threatening or life-shortening. They're chronic. They often occur in children. We need natural history studies. We're getting more and more of them done. There was recently a meeting in Washington about natural history studies, and there's more and more of an emphasis as to what should constitute a good natural history study in populations. Many diseases, if we look at the successes, many diseases that were previously life-shortening now have therapies, 400 approximately. Many of those occurred in children, and they're growing into successful adults and paying back society. The knowledge and understanding of orphan diseases and the products to treat them is becoming widespread. And that knowledge doesn't just stop then with orphan diseases. We learn about common diseases at the same time. It goes both directions. And today in the US, more than 15 million patients and their families are positively impacted by these successes. If you take those almost 400 approved drugs, if you say that an average family size is 4, and you look at the population of each of those diseases, you come up with 15 million people in the US. That's not a bad return on investment. And with that, I will see what questions you have. Oh, I've got a couple more slides. I think I'll stop because I'm allergic to mackerels.
Was drug repurposing versus new molecular entities? And also, and I'll have the other half after. No,
most were not repurposing. Okay. There were some that were variations on old drugs or variation on molecules that were well known, so they can't be called new molecular entities, but they'd not been used in that situation before. So 1/3, or actually about 38% now, are new molecular entities, and the rest are others.
Okay. And do you know what proportion of these rare diseases are treated with drugs that are not approved for that indication?
Well, if there are 7,000 rare diseases, then 6,600 are being treated off-label.
Or not treated.
Or not treated. No, I don't know. And for instance, I'm working with a company now that has a drug that looks like it has excellent utility. The drug has been around for close to 30 years. It was one of the early orphans. The originating company has no intention of doing anything with that drug. I'm trying to find someone to develop it. It's off patent. They'd get 7 years exclusivity in the US, which is a very valuable incentive, and there's probably a use patent that's available. So, you know, they'd get some intellectual property protection. But I'm having to use all my creative skills to find the right company.
Matthew?
So thank you, Marlene. Last year in JAMA, there was a study published by Avorn and Kesselheim, maybe someone else, where they compared non-orphan and orphan drugs in cancer. And they suggest, or they claim to have found, that there's been a significant departure from accepted clinical trial standards in the case of orphan drugs. So they talked, and more so than you would expect, just given the constraints of smaller populations and so on. And so I was thinking when you were sort of talking about getting different answers around different review, depending on which review division actually looks at your submission, whether there's an opportunity, and this is just a half-baked idea, but I'm curious about your thoughts, for some institutional innovation. So maybe some kind of practice where there has to be consensus with more than one division that reviews it, so that if we know that the departure, if it's absolutely necessary, you at least have two groups signing off, given the kind of variation that you're reporting.
I think that's an excellent question. I don't know of any effort in that direction. The current directions, and I haven't read that particular article, but the current thinking is to be broader and do a lot more post-marketing evaluation rather than as much pre-marketing. So I'm not exactly sure where things are going, but you know, there were the reports last week, I think, on FDA taking a different look at breast cancer and looking at shrinkage of tumor size rather than time to recurrence. So I don't know.
So many, many genetic diseases kynurenine and things like that. So can you tell me whether these are drugs and do they require approval if, suppose, tryptophan? How does that work? What is a drug in that case and what isn't?
Well, it's not easy. But if you're using it to treat a disease and it has an action on the mechanism of how the body reacts, it's a drug. L-carnitine is a very good example. L-carnitine is an approved drug, approved for primary L-carnitine deficiency and secondary L-carnitine deficiency. It can also be purchased in a natural food store. You do not know that the product that you get off the shelf really has in it what it says it does. And if you test it, the different lots may well be different. Then to add further confusion, the same company that makes it as a drug also makes it as a health food. Do they put the same product on the shelves of the health food store? I don't know. It's not an easy answer. Betaine is another one that I think is available in health food stores. Zinc acetate for Wilson's disease. They're all available, but you don't know whether they're made under GMP. We do know that those have been studied and found to be safe and effective for their intended use in the way that they were made, tested, and formulated. If you want to make a disease claim, then you need to have it studied, reviewed, and approved as a drug. If you're going to put it on a shelf and you have a sign further down the shelf that says improves your eyesight, it's not a drug.
Even if it's a new molecular entity, as opposed to something you extract from seaweed?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on health food shelves that have never been looked at, and at least at one time might have been new molecular entities when they arrived there. Every country has their own guidelines for this. Ours in the US are pretty loose. Something called DSHEA, which allows things onto the shelves of health food stores with very little, if any, testing. There's no incentive for the companies to test it if they can sell it anyway. And there is support in Congress not to change that. So that's where it lies.
I'm going to jump in at that point. Thank you very much, Marlene, for an excellent presentation and for sharing some insight, if you will, to what happens behind the curtain and that delicate balance between expediting access and ensuring safety at the same time. So thank you again, Marlene.